It's my very great honor today to introduce our colloquium speaker, Professor Roy Glauber. It certainly isn't every day that we welcome a Nobel laureate to Los Alamos, and it's even rarer that we have the opportunity to greet one who has such an intimate connection with Los Alamos. Having developed an interest in science in high school, I read the biography on the Nobel website, and particularly optics as an offshoot of your interest in astronomy, I believe. He was nurtured by attendance at Bronx High School of Science and involvement at the American Institute at the City of New York. But I was most, I think, astounded to recognize, I think you were admitted to Harvard at the ripe old age of 16, if I'm not mistaken. So those of you out there who think you are smart, think again. But after, of course, everything changed on university campuses after the U.S. entry into World War II, Roy was subject to an accelerated physics program, taking graduate courses quickly before they were suspended for the wartime. And by his own assertion, he, quote, managed to assimilate most of the courses of a graduate school education by the time he turned 18 in September of 1943. So he was asked at that time to join a mysterious project out west. And after a few weeks' wait to get a security clearance, there's another difference, he arrived at Los Alamos. Although certainly he was one of the youngest scientists, he was one of a very young cohort. And I had a really nice email exchange with Alan Carr, who told me that the most common age, the median age during World War II at Los Alamos was 27, and the average age was a little over 29. So there were a lot of younger folks who hadn't finished their schooling. So for instance, Harold Agnew was still a student at the time. So Robert Oppenheimer was one of the oldest, an old man in his late 30s. If you recognize that our average age now at the laboratory is about 53, and perhaps 40% of our R&D staff is actually a little younger, thanks in part to all of the students and postdocs we bring in, but 47% of our R&D staff, and I will say with embarrassment including myself, is over 50 years old. But it's also fair to say that we continue to be revitalized and invigorated by the inclusion of students and postdocs in our everyday work here at the laboratory. I think we're going to have a great opportunity. One of the upsides of our projected workforce shifts that will take place over the next 5 to 10 years is we're going to have the opportunity to be reinvigorated by earlier career staff at the laboratory. And hopefully we can still build on the legacy of providing a dynamic environment for them, as well as for benefiting from new ideas and new perspectives. We may never get to the point where we have a cohort that included this many Nobel laureates, including Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Fitch, Reines, Alvarez, others. But we know we will have a really vital set of scientists who come and stay at this laboratory, as well as those who become our alumni and take positions around the world. Insights into Professor Glauber's work here at the laboratory were provided. I think I didn't have a chance to project this, but Alan actually pulled out an original document from the archives that was a questionnaire that every employee completed upon leaving Los Alamos. The cover memo said it was for purposes of bibliography and future publicity. So this is perhaps that future publicity. And I think you wrote down one line that you did work in neutron diffusion, if I'm not mistaken. But that's, of course, as many of you in the audience know, that's really important for details like figuring out critical mass. So he worked for Los Alamos for about 2 years and authored classified publications. We also had a comparator page from Enrico Fermi's exit. He had a few more lines on his document. So after the war, Professor Glauber resumed his undergraduate work at Harvard, and as they say, the rest is history. And Peter Milani's going to give a fuller accounting of his technical contributions. But I think we could keep going, but I'd really like to hear what Professor Glauber can share. So let me just close by saying on behalf of Dr. McMillan, Dr. Bishop, and all of Los Alamos National Laboratory, welcome, and we look forward to your recollections.
So I'm Peter Maloney. I'm currently a guest scientist in the theoretical division. I'll keep this brief. I had an overhead slide of the theoretical division roster in 1945, which is really a remarkable collection of people. To sort of segue into the work that won Professor Glauber the Nobel Prize for, quote, his contributions to the quantum theory of optical coherence, I'd like to recall that a number of scientists from the Manhattan Project, when the war was finished and they went into back to basic research, made seminal contributions to the quantum theory of radiation or quantum electrodynamics. Hans Bethe, who was the theoretical division leader, was the first to calculate or extract really from non-relativistic quantum electrodynamics an accurate number for the Lamb shift, which is a small shift in the energy levels of the hydrogen atom that was not predicted by the Schrödinger or Dirac wave equations for the electron in the Coulomb field of the nucleus. Feynman developed based on his famous diagrams, developed an approach to relativistic QED, and he was able to get an accurate number for the Lamb shift, as was Weisskopf, who was deputy director of T division, using what at the time were more conventional methods of quantum electrodynamics, of quantum mechanics, perturbation theory. Robert Serber, who was the group leader of the small group T2 that Professor Glauber was in, had earlier done some important work on vacuum polarization. And Professor Glauber later, with another member of the group, Laureate, did some work on vacuum polarization in muonic atoms. But so this was all very nice, and these were pioneering, heroic, Nobel-winning theories. But the theory developed by Feynman, Schwinger, and Tamanaga really was not very well suited to address the new sorts of experiments that were being done and the new devices that came later, like the maser and the laser. To give you just one example of the kind of confusion that persisted even among the best theorists of the time, I'd like to recall an experiment of Hanbury, Brown, and Twiss, experiments by Hanbury, Brown, and Twiss in the 1950s. Previously, people had done for time immemorial experiments in optics where you interfere electric fields and measure intensities. What Brown and Twiss did, and this could be considered one of the first experiments in the new field of quantum optics, was they actually measured correlations of intensities, or in photon language, photon correlations. And what they found was very interesting. What they found was that for thermal light, black body radiation, and other chaotic sources of light, that the photons, when counted at different points in time and space, tended to arrive in pairs. There was a statistical tendency for them to be counted together, the so-called photon bunching effect. Well, to give you an idea, and this created a lot of confusion because Dirac had said, the famous dictum of Dirac, that photons only interfere with themselves. They never interfere with each other. And the Brown-Twiss experiments for all the world seemed to show that photons were, in some sense, interfering with each other. So one person whose name I don't recall even thought that a hoax was being perpetrated. That's how confused people were. So another example, I found a piece in Physics Today from July 2002. Hanbury Brown gave a colloquium at Caltech in which he described this photon bunching effect, or actually an interferometer based on the effect. And to quote from Physics Today, Richard Feynman jumped up during the talk and said, "It can't work." Hanbury Brown responded, "Yes, I know, we were told so, but we built it anyway, and it did work." Well, late that night, Feynman phoned and woke up Hanbury Brown to say, "You're right." A more detailed version of the story that I've heard is that prior to that late-night phone call and following Brown's talk, Feynman went into his office and emerged 6 hours later, much the worse for wear, and said, "It's obvious." So that's an example of the kind of confusion that was all, without much exaggeration, it was all clarified by Professor Glauber.
Stay next to the microphone.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Which also reminds me, I'm supposed to announce that at 7:30 this evening at Fuller Lodge there is a question and answer. At 7:30 this evening at Fuller Lodge, there's a question and answer session with Professor Glauber at Fuller Lodge, 7:30 p.m. I'm sorry, and I'll try to stay near the mic. Okay, so that I gave you one example of the kind of confusion that the new quantum optics and the new devices created. When the laser came along, were the photons in the laser going to be correlated or not? And these were all questions that were answered by Glauber in papers, seminal papers published, 2 papers especially in 1963. So I will glibly summarize some of the technical details. The experts will forgive me, I hope. What Professor Glauber showed was that all of these experiments in the field of quantum optics could be understood and explained and calculated based on certain field correlation functions. And that if you knew the density operator for the field, the density matrix, you could calculate all of these correlation functions. And surprising to me at the time was the fact that you could actually always write that density operator in diagonal form, the so-called Glauber P distribution. And his work also made it clear that there's a rich variety of quantum states of light. And some of the properties of these quantum states of light cannot in any sense be understood using classical electromagnetic theory based on Maxwell's equations. And many of those effects have since been observed, things like photon, anti-bunching, squeezing, and so forth. So his work is so commonly known and taken for granted these days that sometimes his papers are not even cited as they should be. So his H-index probably suffers for that. But so the work is cited in areas ranging from foundations of quantum theory to fiber optic communications. Yes. So again, please join me in welcoming and thanking Professor Glauber.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be here. And if people are really interested in this quantum optics stuff, they should have been at UNM during the latter part of last week. I can't come back to Los Alamos, of course, without remembering my days here, and that's precisely what I was planning to talk about this afternoon. I just happened to see one of the closing documents connected with my stay here in 1945, and I noticed that ended only in late December. I was very reluctant to leave the place. I did love it that much. It was in those last few months becoming a very awkward place to be as my friends and colleagues were leaving in droves, and a terrible shortage of water developed, I now remember. The place was almost completely dry. You'd turn a faucet and hear a vague squeak and see nothing emerge. All the water that came up the hill came by truck, and there weren't too many trucks in those weeks. It took some time to remedy that, I gather. Anyway, I really loved the place and have contrived to return some number of times, but always in connection with projects other than bomb production. In fact, I returned many times in connection with the Meson production factory, which was run by Louis Rosen and was quite a remarkable accelerator in its day. I'm sure it exists still, but I haven't the faintest idea what it would be doing these days. Maybe you can tell me. Well, I want to deal here just with recollections of the Manhattan Project, and I'd like to show you a few pictures which represent prehistory, long before I was here, and just as part of the introduction. So let me first show, there they are, two pictures of the James Chadwick, who really discovered the neutron, which the year is, I think, 1932. And to his right, you see Niels Bohr, who was responsible for many things in the history of the quantum theory. But the particularly relevant thing here is a model of the nucleus as a kind of droplet, a liquid droplet. And we'll come back to that. Next, we have a picture from the middle 1930s of Enrico Fermi. Fermi used these neutrons in a remarkable series of very inexpensive experiments in Rome with quite a remarkable group of young men around him. He made any number of discoveries of what goes on when neutrons are allowed to impinge on various sorts of nuclei. One thing he found was that they induced nuclear reactions. That was no surprise because neutrons will freely enter a nucleus. They're not repelled by any electric fields. And there were many, many interactions inspired by these impinging neutrons. Well, one of his first discoveries was that when he performed these very experiments on a wooden table, he got results which were vastly more effective than when he performed them on a marble table. Why in the world should that be? Well, the answer is, again, Fermi was very astute about this sort of thing. He understood that the neutrons didn't, in this case, go in any unique beam. They were going all over the place. They were being, in fact, scattered by the table beneath. And a wooden table contains a lot of hydrocarbon elements, which are rather light. And neutrons colliding with those nuclei would lose more energy than neutrons colliding with the heavier atoms in marble. So they would lose energy. And it turned out that neutrons, when their energy was lowered, were far more effective in inducing nuclear reactions. That was probably the great discovery. He also let his neutrons impinge on uranium and got quite a variety of different results, resulting nuclei flying off. He wasn't able to analyze them. He assumed that they included, for example, transuranic elements, but he had no way of proving that. And in 1938, he had the opportunity with his family to leave Rome and receive the Nobel Prize. There he is. But he created as many problems as he solved in the course of all this. One was, what were these, explained this great variety of things that flew off when neutrons impinged on uranium. A man who was very puzzled by this, and certainly Fermi in this period, going on to America, had no opportunity to investigate that further. The man who was puzzled by this was a chemist, Otto Hahn, and there he is with his young assistant, Lise Meitner. Hahn and published a paper with Strassmann, which eventually was a Nobel Prize paper, identifying not identifying, I should say, the individual nuclei flying off, but giving their properties, their chemical properties. And one of the most conspicuous of these was something that had all the properties of barium. That was a terrible puzzle to him, and that puzzle was resolved, in fact, by his young assistant, who had just fled Germany in 1939, was in Stockholm, and with her nephew, Otto Frisch, whom you'll see somewhat later, theorized that what was actually happening was something simply without precedent, that some of the uranium, and I think the guess was a particular known isotope, uranium-235, was actually being shaken up so badly that the nucleus was splitting in half, and these highly charged nuclei would go flying off. It's amazing that this property was unknown, but the reason was that these highly charged fission fragments are so easily stopped by matter, they're so highly charged, that a layer of cellophane stops them. And there were, in fact, many investigators who had failed to notice that what actually was happening was the fission of uranium. Well, that set people to thinking. It appeared in the newspapers. I remember, I was a bit of a kid at the time, in 1939. All kinds of speculation about the possibility of generating atomic power this way, because these fragments which would fly off would have altogether too many neutrons to be respectable elements in that part of the periodic table. They'd have to give off an awful lot of energy in the course of all of this, and those neutrons might generate more neutrons. The possibility suddenly was open of a chain reaction. One of the first people to realize this was Leo Szilard, a man with spectacular futuristic vision, and that emerged in many ways later. He was immediately worried by this and felt there should be a project to investigate it. How in the world would he ever make that known to people appropriately? Again, he had a typical Szilard inspiration. He wrote out a letter which he wanted Einstein to sign. This was in August of 1939. And there he is at Einstein's summer vacation place on the far end of Long Island, reading the letter to him. Einstein was happy to sign it without understanding many of the details of the story. He certainly saw it as that ominous. And the letter was in fact dispatched to President Roosevelt through a personal friend whom he knew was a confidant of Roosevelt's. Roosevelt was suitably impressed, conveyed this to the man who was the closest to a science advisor. There wasn't any really in those days, but Vannevar Bush had more or less that role. Bush assembled people, and they began talking about it. Here is one of the conferences with a galaxy of famous people of the day. On the left, Ernest Lawrence, then Arthur Compton, then Vannevar Bush in the middle, seating and laughing, the president of Harvard, James Conant, who was into everything in those days, and to his right, Carl Compton. They appreciated the importance of this, but I'm afraid all they did was to start other committees talking about it. This, remember, was in the middle of 1939, and there was really no serious or united effort to follow this up. There was not talk about a bomb initially, although that possibility was conceived. The idea was developing atomic power. And atomic power didn't seem to be that urgent a matter to the other scientists that it was fully another 3 years before anything material went on. Meanwhile, Fermi was doing significant experiments at Columbia, and I must say America was much better equipped to pursue this sort of research than any other country, better equipped even than Germany, which was relatively well equipped, infinitely better equipped than Japan, and that relevancy, at least, became swiftly evident at the end of my freshman year in college, 1941, or in the middle of my freshman year, I should say. Well, here we are at the beginning of the talk. That all was prehistory. The one man I knew of at Harvard who, of course, my question I asked myself immediately was, is any of this work going on at Harvard? Well, I knew one person, Kenneth Bainbridge, had disappeared from Harvard. He was a mass spectroscopist. And I figured, well, that must have some relevance. There was another story that was going on at the same time I was wondering about this, and that concerned one of the machines that Bainbridge had built at Harvard, a cyclotron. There he is over on the left side of his cyclotron. What in fact was happening, and pretty well concealed, was that a number of people dressed up as officers of the St. Louis Medical Depot came to Harvard and supervised the disassembly of that cyclotron and its shipment off to this non-existent St. Louis Medical Depot. In fact, it was being shipped. You can just guess where. Now, there might have been a hint to what was really going on. This is a photo that was taken at the time of Peter Bridgman on the far right, who was a distinguished professor, and in the middle, Robert R. Wilson, who was a Princeton nuclear physicist, worked with cyclotrons. It was he who was, in fact, supervising, though not too publicly, the shipment of the cyclotron. Where was it being shipped? Well, the same place I was eventually told to ship my own belongings. This was the famous place. Literally the post office box, that's all there was. Now, I don't know how many of you know a post office box. I tried looking for it later in the Santa Fe post office and couldn't find it. But an ordinary post office box doesn't have more than 1 cubic foot of volume in it. And as I understood things at this time, and the time I'm talking about is after I had been 2 years at Harvard and had taken the courses, as you've heard. I had a fair amount of graduate education behind me, but I was only, by that time, a junior in an accelerated program. And I was given a position while I was still a student teaching in the Army Specialized Training Program, and the university tried to get a deferment for me, but having just turned 18, the draft board said that was ridiculous. And I learned that, and I filled out a postcard which was a questionnaire postcard already, from something called the National Roster of Scientific Personnel in Washington. Well, at that time, we were 2 years into the war, most of the people who were faculty members were already accepted into war positions of one sort or another, and most of them naturally had families and weren't anxious to travel any great distances anyway to join other projects. That's why, as you heard, the ages of people at Los Alamos were really so low. Very few people were above their 20s, and there was virtually nobody over 40 in the place. There were a couple of people. Gray hairs were not non-existent, but they were pretty scarce. Well, a man in time showed up at Harvard wearing a dark overcoat. He seemed to know who I was, but it turned out that was from having seen my picture on the roster of students. I had answered a questionnaire saying the courses I had taken, and he said he thought he could find me a position out west. That's the most he would ever say about it. It wasn't till after a week or two that I learned of this post office box address where I was to send everything I wanted to preserve in taking down whatever kind of job it might be. It wasn't difficult getting past the security hurdles. I didn't have any past to speak of. And by a couple of months later, I had been given a ticket to Chicago and a phone number to call to get the ticket out of Chicago. It involved going across the Dearborn Station in Chicago and taking the Santa Fe Railroad to a place called Lamy, New Mexico. And that was an exciting sort of thing. For one thing, I made the discovery of Fred Harvey. I don't know whether you people have been as impressed as I was then, but Fred Harvey had practically, that company had practically all the concessions along the Santa Fe Railroad and in the national parks. And in the course of this day-and-a-half trip, the train was boarded at each stop by Indians, suitably bronzed, and I discovered they were Fred Harvey Indians, and there were Fred Harvey cowboys as well. So when we got to Lamy, it was just a wooden platform. I can't remember another thing of Lamy. But when I got out on the platform, there was a man in a short man in a navy blue overcoat, wearing a derby, who was evidently going to the same place I was. He introduced himself as Mr. Newman, and then he was greeted very shortly by somebody who, for all the world, a cowboy. I figured maybe a Fred Harvey cowboy. He wore dungarees, a checked shirt, and a 10-gallon hat. He greeted Mr. Newman, however, as a friend he hadn't seen for some time. And we went off in the car with this chap driving to East Palace Avenue, the courtyard where Mrs. McKibben greeted people coming to Los Alamos for the first time. This chap was not evidently coming for the first time. He signed his name as John von Neumann. We shortly got in the car. We had to drive north some distance, a good deal further than the usual turnoff at Pojoaque. We had to go up to Espanola. The bridge had washed out, the bridge over the Rio Grande. We had to come back down. And of course, this was going through all the country, which is second nature to you people, but surely was not to me. It was some of the most beautiful country I'd ever seen. And Black Mesa, not the least of it. And during this time, a conversation was struck up between the cowboy, who I later discovered was a mathematician, and Mr. Newman. And Mr. Newman was asking how things were going up there on the hill, and the cowboy said, not very well. Well, what's happening? We're having some trouble with the world lines. Now, world lines, that's a relativistic kind of terminology, and it occurs only in very special scientific contexts. What's wrong with the world lines, asks Mr. Newman. Well, they're intersecting, says the cowboy. They can't intersect, says Mr. Newman. That could only happen if mass is not being conserved. Meanwhile, my eyes are beginning to pop open. Mass is not being, this is the first suspicion I had of what's going up what's happening on the hill. If mass is not being conserved, well, we're having problems. You see, it's all because of the compressibility. What compressibility? The infinite compressibility. Well, it's only a finite change in volume that takes place with the matter, but it's quite important. Well, I won't trouble you with the details as I can remember them of the rest of this conversation. But what was going on was these mathematicians, worried about security, were using high-flown technical terms, which they assumed I wouldn't understand at all, and they were pretty close to right. Describing a calculation. It was one of the first calculations of the implosion. It was a nonlinear calculation done in a two-dimensional model. And when you do such numerical calculations, you have to choose the intervals that you calculate with in certain proportions, or else, in fact, the calculation becomes unstable and quickly degenerates into nonsense. And what Jack Corkin, who was the Fred Harvey cowboy in this instance, what Jack Corkin was describing was a two-dimensional calculation that was going absolutely bananas. That was my introduction. That plus the spectacular canyon country on the ride up to the hill. That was my introduction to the place, and it did very little to confirm any views I had of what was going on here. So there is the ride up. The ancient bridge, it may still be there. You can see to the left of the bridge that was later set up. Well, I don't, here is the geography you know perfectly well. The entrance gate was a little better developed already than this thing, which must have been on the very first day. Here is the way I saw it often. Once up on the hill, I had to have some place I could be put up on, and that was this, a place which was one of the first great houses of the Los Alamos Ranch School to disappear. It was called the Big House. It had, you don't see them here, it had a number of screen porches that some of the students slept on because they were tubercular, and it was sleeping outdoors was considered the right sort of therapy for hardening the lungs. In any case, it was a large house with quite a few rooms, and an enormous pool table, as a matter of fact, in the center. That first night, There was a tall blonde chap, busy practicing pool there and really making everybody else look a bit silly. That was Louis Alvarez, it turned out. Well, the next day, it was necessary to go into the technical area. This is a rather built-up version of the entrance to the technical area. It certainly was not as elegant as that when I first showed up, which was in January then of 1944. I got hold of another picture of what went on just inside that entrance. What interests me is that the person being examined, entering clearly for the first time, was Robert Marshak, who later was the president of City University in New York and who organized all of the high-energy conferences in high-energy physics. How do I know this is his first appearance at Los Alamos? Well, he came only several months after I did, but the clear giveaway is that fedora hat he was wearing. Nobody there for the second day would wear that hat. Now, the photographic people at Los Alamos in those days were very systematic and assiduous in recording the experimental work that was going on within the technical area. But they were, as you will see, thoroughly unsystematic and spotty in trying to record the lives that we were living outside the technical area. This was the main street after I was there for about a year. There had been nothing at all on the right side of this street. This is a building, whoops, hang on, I got the wrong picture there. This is a building which is obscuring what you know as Ashley Pond just to the right. This was E Building, which was eventually the home of the theorists. We were moved across the street from what was the original T Building on this side to have walled off or fenced off areas on both sides of the street meant that the Army had to build overhead passes across the street. So things were pretty ugly and complicated in their ultimate structure after about a year. Well, here is how people lived. One of the early houses, a four-family house. There were quite a few families that were just starting. They would, a couple would get this 3 or 4 room apartment, 4 in this structure, and before very long, they would start having babies. The local hospital, which was a small one, certainly had one of the highest birth rates in the U.S. Army. These young folks in their 20s were enormously productive. And here is how we lived. Again, you see snow on the ground in several of these. This, I believe, is meant not to illustrate our living quarters, the family living quarters. That's not how the bachelors lived. But I think there was a forest fire off here, up in the Pouillet area, several miles north. Indeed, they rounded up a bunch of us to go up and try and contain that fire. It was the first and only experience I've ever really had with forest fires, and it's quite a difficult business. You people have had much more experience with that since. Well, this is what a neighborhood looked like in the middle of the dwelling area. It's slightly later construction, plasterboard used. There are a couple of those houses with that construction still standing and well painted over, I gather. All of the unmarried women in the place lived in this dormitory, a couple of tens of them. And this is what a dormitory room looked like, not mine, but you could scarcely tell. It had showers and a large community bathroom down the hall. One of the most prominent features of the place was this enormous military force called the Special Engineering Detachment. Now, who was in the Special Engineering Detachment? It was remarkably random. The draft boards had no ways of picking out the talents or skills or experiences of people as they were drafted in general. It was thoroughly random who seemed to have one or another skill that would be useful at Los Alamos, and indeed we never fully understood how it was that these people were found. But there were some hundreds of them who felt, they should have felt, of course, grateful for being delivered from the fighting fronts. All of them were complaining uniformly with the awareness that they were skilled labor of one form or another, machinists, laboratory technicians of every sort, that they were, in effect, living in dormitories and being paid no more than whatever GIs received, while the other people in the laboratories, we who remained civilians, were being paid actual salaries. Of course, those salaries didn't amount to a great deal either. I think mine only in the second year climbed to $25 a week. Well, the ultimate insult for the SEDs was that they had officers. These officers were people with no skills whatever, but they felt the obligation to exercise the authority of officers and get everybody out at 6 in the morning for a drill prior to showing up at the lab at what was supposed to be 8 a.m. Now, this is a part of the project you know well. This is where the supervisors of the ranch school lived, and some of the division leaders of the Los Alamos project. It became promptly known by its unique character as a bathtub row. They were the only bathtubs on the hill. We had showers everywhere else. Well, some of the people. This was Hans Bethe, the leader of the theory division that I was in. He was enormously skilled and ingenious, absolutely remarkable in being able to bring you an estimate of just about any ridiculous question and answering almost any question you could ask. He had a wonderful facility with formalism and particularly with real numbers, and he had a tiny calculator. We all had electrical calculators on our desks. His was a tiny thing he had brought from Germany, which you had to crank by hand. Here was someone introduced to us as the leader of the entire project, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Endless speculation, of course, was what did that J stand for? And some people thought Jehovah. But in fact, it wasn't revealed until 1954. That was the essential revelation, as far as I'm concerned, in the later Oppenheimer proceedings, that it's Julius. Here he was, in his way, quite a remarkable person. I'll say a few things about him. This is perhaps the most characteristic picture of him. You rarely saw him without that pork pie hat. He didn't, however, lecture in it. But the cigarette, you never saw him without the cigarette, in essence. And he was a person of very considerable intellect. And everyone at Los Alamos understood this. And of course, he had distinguished himself as a Harvard undergraduate by studying Sanskrit, and would often throw at us quotations from the Sanskrit scriptures. Here he is as a lecturer, and whenever he appeared any place, and I will give him this credit as well, though he was a theorist through and through and never touched anything experimental, or so it seemed, he managed to visit every activity on the project and acquaint himself very well with what was going on there. And whenever he visited any place, he left his signature near the door if he didn't wear it all the way through. Now, there's another name all of you know, Edward Teller. I didn't know very much of Oppenheimer. He had not really written very many famous papers. He was regarded as a giant intellect in the field, but was not known for what he had written. And let me tell you, if you tried reading what he had written, you would find it remarkably obscure. And if you didn't, I'll have to tell you later, when I worked with him a bit, if you didn't write your own papers with that degree of obscurity, he really wouldn't approve. He felt that this was not a business for fools, and those are the sorts of people you would have reading the easy papers. Well, the first office I was in, with a couple of others, had next to it, this was in the old wooden T building, an empty office. That empty office had the name Edward Teller scrawled on the door, and Teller was absent. Teller had in fact been away for something like a month, and no one had any idea when he might return. He had been so offended by not having been given any position of high responsibility in the original organization in 1943 that he simply left. Oppenheimer, with respect for Teller's intellect, wheedled him back again, promising him that he would have a division all his own. And his only interest then and later was in creating not the weapon that we were supposed to be working on, which was, I must say, quite a shock to me. I certainly knew nothing of a bomb in going there. I was asked by Bacher on the first interview what my guess was about what they were working on. I very learnedly told him I thought it would be something having to do with uranium-235 chain reaction. He said, well, that's a very good guess, but as it happens, that was accomplished a little over a year ago in Chicago. He then went on to explain that it was a really fast reaction that they were looking for this time, and explained that it was a bomb. And I must say that really did shake me up quite a bit, and I remained shook for some months, in fact, after that. Teller doesn't seem ever to have been shaken by that sort of thing. His interest was in the super. The super was always to be the hydrogen bomb, and he had done a great deal of work, but to no practical effect in trying to design such a weapon. Everything he had his friends work on, in this particular division that he was given to put together, 5 or 6 guys, every such reaction fizzled out and did not become a thermonuclear reaction. And indeed there was none, as you know, until the early 50s. Teller's work in that sense was certainly important, but it was an important failure. Now, some more people at Los Alamos. Here is Emilio Segre. Emilio Segre, after I had been there some months, brought us back some bad news regarding plutonium. I haven't mentioned plutonium to this point, but plutonium was one of the things produced in the reactor, eventually via decay of neptunium, and plutonium did have an isotope which was fissionable with low energy neutrons. That much had been ascertained. But the problem was, could you make a bomb of it? You could only make a bomb of it if you could manage to assemble it into a supercritical configuration, and it takes a certain length of time to do that, before a neutron started a chain reaction. Now, if there are many neutrons emitted spontaneously by just ordinary plutonium, which is just sitting there, it means that there are always neutrons present, and if you try assembling this plutonium into a supercritical configuration, it will begin to explode before you've gotten anywhere, because the reaction goes that fast. So this was, in a way, very bad news. It was known that they had milliseconds to work with for ordinary uranium, and that was the basis of the gun design, which was the original design of the uranium-235 bomb. You can assemble a supercritical configuration within milliseconds, thousandths of a second, and stand a considerable chance of not getting a premature detonation. That would never be possible with plutonium. Plutonium would have to be put together into the supercritical configuration within microseconds, millionths of a second. Well, this is a working group. It's the only such picture I have. That's Segre's group at Los Alamos. And there is Segre. And behind him, the chap who is literally inseparable from him, Owen Chamberlain. The two of them got the Nobel Prize for altogether different work, the discovery of the antiproton in Berkeley after many people had failed to find it. The two of them got it together. The only other person I think I recognize in this is the son of a famous psychoanalyst. This is Martin Deutsch, who was eventually a very distinguished nuclear experimenter at MIT. Well, here's another person who was there, Dick Feynman. Dick Feynman was the head of a small group in the theory division, a remarkably expressive fellow who gave very animated lectures. As I remembered the other night, his father was a salesman in Long Island, a very expressive fellow who must have taught a great deal of expression to Feynman, who was in something of a mathematical prodigy. He had won the intercollegiate mathematics competition as a senior at MIT. But he had various interests. He was a very nervous, rather jumpy fellow. He loved tapping and banging on things, and the discovery of Pueblo Indian drums, which you have locally, was very important to him. And there were people living near the dormitory areas who would swear that there was an Indian uprising going on just because Feynman was out at night on the canyon edge amusing himself. Later, I should say, I replaced Feynman at Caltech in 1950. He moved there and took a sabbatical for his first year. He went off to Brazil and later came back boasting of having spent the entire year playing the bongo drums and marching eventually in their springtime parade. I've forgotten momentarily what it's called. Well, here's Feynman again in a more pensive mood. This is the way we heard colloquia. It was a very important point raised by the initial directors of Los Alamos that contradicted the happy notion that General Groves had in directing the project. Groves's notion was that nobody should have any awareness of what was going on in any other task than his own. That certainly would be best for security. And while that would be best for security, it would be worst for progress. All of the senior people in 1943 agreed that they needed to assemble all of the best ideas, including even the crackpot ideas, of everyone who had something to contribute, that these were problems that had no obvious solutions, and we were going to get nowhere without some real inspiration. The agreement was that there would be weekly colloquia held in the great wooden gymnasium, which was put up by the Army somewhere near where the shopping center is now. And it wasn't gymnasium all the time. On Tuesday nights, I think it was, the MPs would clear everybody out of the gym, set up these canvas chairs. This was a later version of the same thing. I don't have any pictures of our colloquia, but this was a bit later. And it just happens to show Norris Bradbury, John Manley, Fermi, in the back row, Oppenheimer, and Feynman. We sat there and listened to whatever the weekly speaker had to say, and their topics ranged over everything. We had, I'm afraid, many lectures on literally the theory and practice of bombing. There were the British, who had been far ahead of us in starting the nuclear project during the war, and in particular when the German bombs were being rained down on them. They did quite a bit of analysis of the effect of bombing. And William Penny, who was otherwise a solid-state quantum theorist, became one of Britain's primary experts on the theory and practice of bombing. He lectured to us often, I'm afraid. This is Stanislaus Ulam. Now, I have to tell you, he was the purest of pure mathematicians. He came to Los Alamos, and nobody could quite understand why, least of all Stan himself, since he felt that there wasn't a single theorem that had ever been proved rigorously regarding any of the work that we were doing. And he wondered how in the world we can trust anything. He was put in Teller's group, they got on congenially, but Teller would write complaints asking why in the world Ulam was put there, since he was not capable of doing a single thing that that was relevant to the Teller group. Well, that changed over the years. Here we have von Neumann, Feynman, and Ulam sitting on a bench, I guess before the governor's palace in Santa Fe. A good picture of all three of them. Here we have another of the prominent individuals, Nicholas Baker. Now, Nicholas Baker is someone many of you will recognize as Niels Bohr. But there was a problem, and it was already evident. There was a loudspeaker system running through the project, which was people trying to make phone connections and the like were sending these messages over the loudspeaker system. You had only to mention that there would be a lecture by Nicholas Baker, who was a total unknown, and the place would be packed, and there would be people standing in the halls. So that really wasn't very much of a pseudonym, but it does seem to have worked outside the project. What Bohr did for most of his time was to puff on that pipe and make inaudible sounds. He never, Danish is not a language which is crisply articulate at all. It has a rather muffled sound at its best. And with that pipe clenched between his teeth, scarcely opening his lips, he would speak to some of us, to me a good deal years later. He was always striking matches, relighting the ashes of a pipe. Heaven knows when he filled it, but he was in effect smoking matches for the largest part of the day. This is a picture taken in Copenhagen. I couldn't find another one showing his son, Oa. His son, Oa, was always at his side and often coming in an hour or two ahead when Papa was to give a lecture and producing the most precise diagrams in three-dimensional reality on the blackboard, showing all of the screws and drill holes in the piece of apparatus that his father was describing only in the most abstract of terms. This, of course, was General Groves. And I have to tell you, there was, among us civilians, a great deal of disrespect for this man. There were endless insults being passed around, and I won't begin to recall them to you. He was famous for having built the Pentagon, for getting things done on time, and for exacting discipline of his what's the term I want? The various laboring organizations, the corporations and whatnot that were doing this work. It was certainly felt justly that that was an important element of the project, but I have to tell you, it was not the element that produced any of the essential ideas in the project or even understanding of it. Now, here is a somewhat idealized picture of the general, a painting, I might add. this is the way the two of them, Oppenheimer and Groves, frequently appeared before photographers. I would have to say that they were two people who probably, in the normal course of things, would never agree on anything. There was scarcely any idea that the two would hold in common. But they managed, nonetheless, to build up a relationship that actually worked, and worked with an effectiveness that few of us were willing to believe. Oppenheimer was capable of altering his behavior and making such adjustments as he had to make to deal with the general, and somehow the general contrived to do the same for something he absolutely could not comprehend. There is Fermi. You can see that this is a picture that was not taken at Los Alamos, the presence of that vest. It was very likely at Columbia. I can't overemphasize the importance of Fermi's contribution. This was Eugene Wigner, who distinguished himself by never setting foot at Los Alamos. He ran, of course, the Chicago project. One of the things people could do most effectively at Los Alamos was cross-country skiing and just downhill skiing in the nearby slopes. Here you have a party that went out and involved, of course, Fermi over there, Bethe, a wonderfully colorful character named Hans Staub. He was German-Swiss and spoke with the most extravagantly German-Swiss accent I've ever heard. He was an experimenter and very effective. Victor Weisskopf and Bruno Rossi, who ran another important group that made fission cross-section measurements, and several wives whom I can't identify individually now. Anyway, that's how it was often in the winters, and just about our only real recreation besides hiking, which was mostly in the summer. This is a remarkable picture, which is not immediately relevant. It was made in 1931 in Leipzig, and I choose it because it contains the leaders of projects in four, the nuclear projects in 4 countries. George Placzek was a Canadian leader who came eventually to join us. This is Rudolf Peierls, who led the British delegation and came in 1944 with a group of 10 or 20 Brits who were really very skilled in this business, but who didn't have more than theory to go by. One of them, of course, was Klaus Fuchs. This is Giancarlo Wick, who was in Italy all the time and who ended up in Carnegie Tech in writing papers in this field at the end of the war. A fellow named Gentile from Italy, whom I did not know. This is Werner Heisenberg. These people all knew one another well. Felix Bloch. Felix Bloch was to be one of the primary participants in Los Alamos. He withdrew, however, and kept working on other things in Stanford. This is Vicky Weisskopf, who was deputy division leader of the theory at Los Alamos. And this German named Sauter, I don't remember where he ended up. But this already in 1931 shows you the roots from which a great deal of the ultimate development took place. Well, here we have one of the models under construction of the reactor in Chicago. I show this mainly because of the cubic shape of the whole thing. One of the plans was if it was necessary to have still more scattering power within the graphite. Helium was known to diffuse into graphite. And all they had to do then was to surround this whole thing with a cube-shaped balloon, fill it with helium. The helium would diffuse into the graphite, and if they had been unable to get the whole business to react before then, it would certainly be aided by the diffusion of the helium. This was one of those crazy ideas that looked like a very real project. General Groves was given the assignment of producing cube-shaped balloons, getting them out of the rubber industry in Akron, and that's the reason I show this. He succeeded in doing that. There was a whole production of these cube balloons which were never used because they weren't necessary. It worked without them. Here is the electromagnetic separation plant in Oak Ridge, quite an enormous institution all by itself. The reactors, several of them, at Hanford, Washington. Here, what's left of one of them. These reactors harbored, eventually, one of the great secrets of the nuclear project. When the reactor was first turned on, it powered up precisely as intended, and then the power began sinking and sinking and went to zero. That reactor, it appeared, would not work at all. Well, fortunately, they had designed additional reactivity in the reactor sufficient that they were able to get the reactor up and going again. But what this represented was the discovery overnight, and again it was Fermi who understood this, that there was a plutonium fission fragment which had not been seen earlier because it was very scarce, but which had an enormous ability to devour neutrons, to absorb neutrons. 1,000 times more, I think, than any isotope which had ever been noticed before. And it's only by that fortunate chance that the reactor was over-designed that it ever worked in the first place. The Smythe report, which you know about at the end of the war, within a week of the end of the war, the Smythe report about the nuclear project was generated, and it produced an enormous amount of almost complete description of all the work done at Los Alamos. But it, of course, did omit a certain number of things. One of the little things it omitted was any mention of that isotope, xenon-135, which was this remarkable surprise that they found in getting the Hanford reactor started. Well, here's something that you don't hear much of. This is the beginning of the construction of a wooden platform at the Trinity site in Alamogordo. Now, I was not part of the Trinity experiment as a theorist, not welcome. They didn't want other extraneous people running around there. As a matter of fact, as you know, when finally the Trinity Test was performed, they had already prepared a news clip saying that there had been an accidental release of explosive materials at Alamogordo, including pyrotechnics, they added. And it's a very little thing, about 4 or 5 lines long. And they wanted to be able to make a straight story that there wasn't any huge population there to see the blast. This is one of the things that was being done in preparation, however, a wooden platform being put up, and then on it there was a mounting of a large mass. Now, I saw it as roughly spherical. That was 100 tons of explosive, ordinary explosive, TNT. There were various things. There were radioactive bits mixed in it. They wanted to see how that material would be dispersed. And they wanted, above all, to know how the blast that it produced would be related to the amount of energy released in the explosion. So this was just an ordinary, you might say, flat-footed explosion of 100 tons of TNT that was to be set off just as a calibration. That's one of the things you might not have known about. Here is another. Early in 1944, there was the possibility that we might test a weapon and it wouldn't work. And if it didn't work, we would lose, for example, the isotope material, which it had taken a whole year's isotope separation to produce. Well, something was designed, a great tank made of solid steel. We didn't know what to call it. Jumbo, someone suggested, so this was Jumbo. Jumbo could only be sent across the United States on a specially designed flat car. That was it, coming out to New Mexico. Then here it was on a specially designed truck being taken down to Alamogordo. And I have to tell you, it was never used. It was set to one side. There was considerable worry that it might represent a scandal of some sort. I have no idea what the cost was, but that was the largest massive single piece of steel ever fabricated in America. And it must have represented quite an expense. But the uranium-235 material was so slow in being produced that it seemed like a very good idea to struggle to contain it. Of course, it would have had the disadvantage that if the bomb really worked, this business would just be vaporized and you'd never see it again. But at least there was the possibility of saving this extremely scarce material. Well, it was set to one side and never used at the Trinity Test. And somebody, I was just asking earlier today about it, had the notion that one ought at least to test the thing, and a 500-pound charge of TNT was put within it. And here is what resulted. I don't know what has happened to the rest of Jumbo since. Well, now I have some pictures related to the Trinity Test, and you've certainly seen these before. Let me go through them rather quickly. There's the tower that was put up in Alamogordo. They wanted it off the ground, heaven knows. It was inevitably going to be an airdrop. The most effective way of using the bomb was to set it off at several thousand feet above the Earth, to use as much of the blast, this spherical blast, as possible, and do as little burning and radiation damage as possible. But that's not how the Trinity Test could be conducted. There is an early stage of the gadget, as we called it. We never used the term bomb. It was always the gadget. At the top of the tower, and that's Norris Bradbury, I think, next to it, a naval commander. You don't quite see him in uniform. Here, examining the bomb, you see the silhouette, a familiar silhouette. You know who that is. Here he is a little more explicitly, again, looking at the bomb. He had climbed to the top of the tower. Here is the bomb in a better state of assembly. It was a spherical implosion bomb. Here is, I'll just show one or two pictures of the blast. This is after milliseconds. You see the expanding shock, well, I'll just leave it at that. Here is what you saw from a considerable distance, miles, where most of the few spectators were watching. There is an interesting thing you see a little of above it. I should say disobeying security regulations with some people managed to get a lift to the top of Sandia Peak, hoping we'd see something from up there. Of course, we were in no radio contact. There were 2 or 3 cars of people who drove up there to see what they could see. This was on the evening of the 15th of July, I think. It was to go off at 2:30 in the morning. We saw lightning strikes off there in the distance. It wasn't clear whether we'd see the direct flash or not. As the time grew later and later, people became very impatient watching. I was probably the most dogged of the lot, sitting there still at 5:30 in the morning, imagining something might happen that would be visible. What one saw was a kind of dawn that took place in the south. Behind the mountains, the direct flash was obscured for us 100 and some odd miles away. The direct flash was obscured, but of course the light in the sky was more intense than a typical dawn. It didn't last very long. But then we saw above it something which nobody has talked about much since then. If there is a layer of moisture in the atmosphere, the expanding blast wave, which is hemispherical in this case, first gives a great compression and then quite an expansion following it. And that expansion produces a condensation, as it does in so-called cloud chambers. And you have ring clouds that develop above the thing. I guess you could call it the cloud chamber effect. But to see those rings suddenly expanding from nowhere in the course of a couple of seconds is alone quite spectacular. Well, whoops. Here is the sight from the air. There was a good deal of sand melted. This melted sand called trinitite, dark green in color. A great deal of it was collected, but not that much, by members of the experimental groups. They brought it back. I managed to leave Los Alamos with a box of the stuff, which I brought to my old high school, and I left a small box of it with my mother in New York, who promptly threw it out, suspecting that it was more than a little radioactive, and she was right. The other blast that I showed you, the 100-ton blast, took place here, and you see the results of that. The interesting thing is that you see the effect of both blasts in this picture. Well, here is what happened when the bigwigs were able to march in wearing no more than flannel slippers around their shoes. You see, of course, the general and Oppenheimer beneath his pork pie hat, and Vicky Weisskopf over on the far right. They were examining here just one of the concrete supports of one of the steel girders that held up the tower. Well, there ensued a period of 2 weeks or so in which the estimates were rather confused, but they certainly indicated that the bomb had done rather more than any of us expected, because in fact the most detailed predictions, taking into account all of the things that could have misbehaved, produced lower and lower estimates of what the actual tonnage equivalent of TNT might be. There was a pool held in Oppenheimer's office. I can't remember whether it was $1 or $2 that you had to pay to enter it, and you put your guess, I would have to say, on a particular sheet in a book kept by Oppenheimer's secretary, and the man who won the entire sum was I.I. Robbie of Columbia, who was an occasional visitor and really no expert on these things. He simply thumbed through the book and found the largest interval between other people's guesses. And he came out right with about 16,000 tons of TNT. In the next weeks, there was actually the gun assembly, which was not tested at Trinity, was shipped to Japan. The ship that in fact conveyed the part other than the warhead, as soon as it had dropped, as soon as it had left it at Tinian and was itself steaming away from Tinian, was sunk by the Japanese. So here is the bomb, the implosion bomb, therefore the Nagasaki bomb, being prepared already, I think, before it was shipped abroad. Here is the British delegation, Penny, Lord William Penny on the left. Otto Frisch, the nephew of Lisa Meitner, is the second from the left, and then Rudolf Peierls, and I keep forgetting the name of the Brit on the right. They had just been given medals for their participation, which in theoretical terms and some experimental terms was quite significant. General Groves, I must say, in his valedictory address to us, which was about a month later when he was leaving the project, explained how bitterly he regretted ever allowing the British into the project to begin with, that it was really a matter of sharing the glory, which he wasn't anxious to do, but the British, in fact, started out by knowing a good deal more about this business than we did. Meanwhile, there was a meeting taking place in Potsdam. Harry Truman, in the middle, had ascended to the presidency without knowing a blessed thing about the project. He was told about it in his first days as president. With the war over and all of the consequent joy, Los Alamos was made an award, which was the same award given to people that produced absolutely anything, shoes, pajamas, or what have you during the war. There was Oppenheimer and the general, and the president of the University of California, who, in a sense, was a kind of official director of the project and had really never known a thing about the place. That's Robert Gordon Sproul. Oppenheimer became immediately a national hero and remained so for a time. In 1947, I got to meet him again at Harvard. Here is the set of honorary degree recipients, and lost in the glare of General Marshall, James Conant, Omar Bradley. You have Oppenheimer off there at the far left. Here is the meeting that took place, the first assembly really trying to put theoretical physics back together again, that took place in Shelter Island in Long Island. That's Willis Lamb, Oppenheimer, Bram Peiss, Feynman, Vicky Weisskopf, Julian Schwinger, David Bohm. These were more or less the young leaders of the profession, and things really started up again. And as Peter mentioned a short time ago, this was the beginning again of theoretical physics after the war. Louis Stross, who was one of the members of the board of the Institute for Advanced Study, suggested that Oppenheimer be made director of the Institute for Advanced Study here in 1948. He is talking to some of his students upstairs. Oppenheimer became one of the heroes of that age and remained so for several years. Here is a later picture on the cover of Time magazine with this wonderful quotation, "What we don't understand, we explain to each other," which is a very good description of theoretical physics. He was photographed, of course, with Einstein, though there was very little communication between them. Einstein was quite an old man at the time, and Oppenheimer was traveling all the time to Washington. I was at the Institute. We didn't see him very often. He spent most of his time posing in stained glass attitudes, as they say, and quoting things from the Hindu scriptures to the newspapers who didn't understand them. Meanwhile, jealous Edward Teller was making more and more noise about the urgency of building the hydrogen bomb, though he was no better able to do it at this stage than he had been earlier. And one of the chaps who became something of a spokesman in this area was Admiral Louis Stross. Now, Stross is an admiral who had never been to sea. He was a Wall Street operator, and he, in fact, became the administrator of the Atomic Energy Commission, and his principal profit and authority was, at this time, uniquely Edward Teller, and the problem was building the hydrogen bomb. Well, here by about this is going on into the 60s. I'm skipping over here a particularly nasty period in which, in order to remove Oppenheimer from any power, even though his security clearance was set to lapse within half a year, Admiral Stross produced and presided over a kind of loyalty proceeding which was without precedent in American history. A lot of the testimony was held in secret, and they produced as much damaging material, damaging to the reputation of Oppenheimer, as they possibly could. They were, of course, tapping his telephones at the time. They were tapping his lawyers' telephones, all of them, and it was a simply extraordinary procedure. Teller testified that although he did not believe that Oppenheimer was in any sense explicitly disloyal, that he was so completely incapable of understanding Oppenheimer's motivations that he felt the nation would be far safer with Oppenheimer removed from authority and from clearance. Well, that happened in '54, and he did assume, more or less, Oppenheimer's position of authority as far as the country was concerned. Later, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson was rather concerned by that and produced a presidential award for Oppenheimer, which was not much of a consolation prize, and even less of a consolation prize was Teller's marching up to congratulate him following that. Here is the way Oppenheimer looked in that period. Here is the way Teller often appeared in that period. This is when he proposed that the world be surrounded by a collection of nuclear-armed satellites ready to go off at any moment. This was the so-called Star Wars program, which was far more visionary than was appropriate for the age. It could not have been constructed in the first place. But Teller's popularity grew, and here it is at one of its highest points in some sort of a presentation. I can't tell what. Well, what happened subsequently, there are just a couple of pictures left. I found here was a situation in which I knew two people on American postage stamps. Who could imagine that? This, of course, was Niels Bohr. I should say that when he gave a talk at Los Alamos, which he did on several occasions, there would be a pool for how long he was going to speak, and nobody could ever hear anything for the reasons I described to you earlier. And he would have a microphone, indeed, close to his mouth, but he had a habit of turning around, and after 2.5 or 3 revolutions, you would hear a loud pop. The connection would be broken, and then after that, no one would hear a thing. Anyway, he was one of the great heroes of Denmark, and here he is on the 500 kroner note with that pipe clenched between his teeth. And our remaining heroes are right here. I haven't seen them in this pose, but it looks as though Oppenheimer is about to heave a snowball. Well, with that, let me conclude.